Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's in-service training, Elements of Healthy Aging. Today's topic is on vitamin and mineral supplements, and as you can see on the screen, we do have 2 additional sessions remaining in the series. July 13th, the new dietary guidelines for Americans, recommendations for adults for healthy aging, and July 27th, building bodies in balance, healthy aging extension programs. Today's in-service training is brought to you by our multi-state team. From the University of Florida, hi, I'm Wendy Lynch, Central District Regional Specialized Agent and Extension Agent in St. Johns County. Julie England, Extension Agent Emeritus. Dr. Wendy Dahl, Associate Professor and Extension Specialist in the Food Science and Human Nutrition Department. And Kendra Zamoyski, Regional Specialized FCS Agent. Also from Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, Dr. Carlin Raffi, Assistant Professor and Extension Specialist in the Department of Human Nutrition, Foods, and Exercise. And from North Dakota State University, Dr. Julie Garden Robinson, Professor and Food and Nutrition Specialist in the Department of Health, Nutrition, and Exercise Sciences. A few tidbits of info before we begin. If you're looking for a certificate of attendance, it will be available to you at the end of the Qualtrics evaluation, which will be sent out later post-webinar. Please note that a certificate of attendance will only be available for those participating in the live feed. All sessions are being recorded and will be emailed to those registered but unable to attend. And if you enjoyed today's session, please be sure to share the IST with your coworkers. There's still time to register. A quick review on a few Zoom features. Where you are viewing today's presentation, you may have to hover over the page to get your tool options at the bottom to pop up. Once you see it, click that chat icon and the chat box should open up. Please note there's a 2 option using that drop-down menu. You can either send comments and questions to all participants and panelists or privately to the panelists. A brief disclaimer. The information provided is for educational purposes only. Reference to a commercial product does not constitute an endorsement by the webinar team members or their institutions. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Wendy Dahl to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Susan Whiting. She is a Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Nutrition, University of Saskatchewan. She has taught for 31 years in nutrition and dietetics programs in Canada, as well as 10 years in Ethiopia, since completing a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of British Columbia in 1982. Her research spans dietary influences on bone health of children and older adults, effectiveness and safety of micronutrient supplements, and food security at local, institutional, and international levels. Her focus has been on calcium and vitamin D, and recently she contributed chapters to the 3rd edition of Principles of Nutritional Assessment on these nutrients. She has served as Canadian representative on 2 Institute of Medicine dietary reference intake panels and has been a reviewer several times. She is a member of Scientific Advisory Board of Osteoporosis Canada and is a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. She is Associate Deputy Editor on several international journals and has served on international advisory boards related to bone health, dietary supplements, and vitamin D.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dahl, for inviting me. Wonderful. So I don't want to repeat all the things that Dr. Dahl said, except to show you a little map of Canada with X marks the spot where I am right now in Saskatoon. And it's a pleasure to be here and talking to everybody. So I'll just get started. I put some disclosures. I am retired and I have no conflict of interest going on right now, but I have had past associations with various food and supplement companies. And in every case, it was my pleasure. It was usually educational, sometimes research-based. I also want to make what I would call a disclaimer. Again, that if I show a product, it's just to illustrate it. And if I happen to mention a product, it will just be because it's top of mind, not that I'm trying to promote it in any way. But I also want to say that I've narrowed the discussion to really talking about supplements that have been made with good manufacturing practice, GMP. And those are products that should have either a USP symbol or some certification of quality. So we're not talking about any supplements that people might be purchasing that haven't gone through some degree of rigor. Now, I didn't put it up here, but the Committee for Responsible Nutrition, CRN, is an organization that ensures supplement quality. So I've set about 3 learning objectives. First of all, you're going to be able, by the end of the session, to identify gap, or sometimes we call them shortfall micronutrients, and in the diet of older Americans. And we also are limiting the discussion to micronutrients because these are certainly the main reason why people are taking supplements. There are certainly other important dietary constituents that such as omega-3 fatty acids that people might want to also consider, but we're going to narrow the focus to just micronutrients that have DRI values. And then secondly, you should be able to describe strategies to improve dietary intakes of these GAP micronutrients. And we're going to explore whether they're effective, culturally appropriate, and safe, and how supplements can fit into these strategies. And finally, I hope you'll be able to appraise the literature on findings about recommending supplement use, because many of them are contradictory. And I'm hoping by the end of the section that you will have your own opinion and be comfortable with it. So we all know what we should eat, and my plate is a simplified version of really the variety aspect of food guides that we've had for not quite a century. I think our food guides were really started in around the 30s or 40s. In Canada, we have a similar guide now. It looks slightly different because they took photographs of foods, but basically half your plate, fruits and vegetables, a portion grains and protein. And at least in your plate, you highlight dairy. But we all know that the plate version of what to eat isn't that simple, because within each of these food groups, there are preferred foods. That is, there are better fruits, there are better vegetables, there are better grains, such as whole grains. There's a movement now for proteins to at least include plant-based because of many of the properties that legumes provide. And a good example of preferred foods is we would probably prefer people consume low-fat, vitamin D fortified milk than, say, ice cream. So there are layers to the messages that we give people. And then within each of these foods that we look at on my plate, there's a caloric cost. And so I've just put some sample numbers because none of these plate versions of food guides give us serving sizes anymore. But say there's just a few less fruit than vegetables, so about 3 fruits, 5 vegetables, 6 grains, 3 proteins, and 3 dairy. It's sort of a typical serving size for a 2,000 kilocalorie intake. And what that means is as we get older and we start eating less calories, we have to be very aware that that means we're going to be eating less food. And Dr. Stastny from the May session did bring this up, that we have to be very mindful of the energy cost of the various foods that we're talking about. So I'll just propose to you, if we're now talking about an older adult who instead of eating 2,000 kilocalories is eating 1,500 or 1,600, what food groups are they now dropping? And would they be dropping a fruit and a vegetable, a dairy and a grain? That means they're going to be ingesting less. Now, just for fun, I didn't even suggest we we dropped protein because, again, from May, we learned that we really need to have protein 3 times a day. So we'll keep that one intact. But by dropping the amounts of these healthy foods that we're consuming, we are now eating less of the micronutrients. So my first question to you is, which are the main gap or shortfall micronutrients in the diet from foods alone of older Americans? And one of these 5 is incorrect. So I'll just give you a minute if you want to write in the chat which one you think. Is it vitamin D? Is it iron? Is it vitamin C? Is it magnesium? Or is it calcium? And we'll come back to the answer. Now, I want to just remind all of us of the DRIs. And as Dr. Dahl mentioned, I have been involved as a Canadian representative and also as a reviewer. And this process has been going on since 1997. And actually, everything was completed in 2004. And then we kind of looked at what we did and started all over again. So in 2011, calcium and vitamin D were redone. In 2019, a new report on sodium and potassium. And I just heard that the energy and macronutrient report is going to be redone. It's such a massive document that it's going to take 5 years to complete. Now, the nice thing about thinking about these DRI books, and they must be at least 3 or 4 feet long in someone's library, is that there's a lot of evidence and a lot of research and a lot of thought that goes into all of the numbers. And so we are going to be looking at that. But the problem with the DRIs is that outside of the nutrition and dietetics field, I really don't think that other health professionals are using them. And if they are, they're not using them correctly. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. But we know that when we use the DRI diagram, it's mainly applicable to the micronutrients, and it's U-shaped. So our risk of inadequacy is high when our intake, and that's really should be shown along this x-axis, when our intake is so low, our risk of inadequacy is very high. And as our intake increases to what half the population needs, the EAR, our risk of inadequacy by definition is 50%. And when we get to the RDA, it's 2.5%, and you're pretty much risk-free. We have this period in between the RDA and the UL where possibly eating more of a nutrient isn't going to benefit you, but it's safe, definitely safe until you reach the UL. And by definition, the UL itself is safe, but eating more increases your risk of excess. Now, because it's dietary intake and we're not as certain when we use intake that we can measure deficiency or toxicity, we don't use those terms on these y-axes. We use inadequacy and excess. The other thing that's important to remember, and we'll be using these numbers, is that the EAR is really the population cutoff that we use, the risk of inadequacy, while we use the RDA to plan for individual diets. But we use the UL for both individuals and populations. So we know that we can measure what people eat. And again, in May, NHANES was discussed. And you're probably very familiar with NHANES and what it can provide. I just wanted to point out that how we measure what we eat, there's many ways, foods and food groups. Today, I'm going to focus a lot on nutrients because we can compare nutrient intakes to their specific DRI values. But also we're mindful that dietary patterns are emerging as being an important way to consider how people eat. And there's always a way to try to have a single number that tells us how healthy diets are. I also just wanted to show people that we have a parallel system in Canada, which was actually based on NHANES. We have a continuing survey as well. And this is a data that I am very familiar with, but I have to say that every time we publish about what Canadians eat, we're always comparing it to NHANES. So I'm quite familiar with NHANES as well. Now, we can also measure food intake in the quality and the types of foods people eat by really going to a grocery store and seeing what they eat. Or we can use government information on disappearance. But as an individual, it's really a fun event, and you might do it with your clients, is to go to a grocery store and just measure how long a shelf is and how tall a shelf is for various foods. This one shows beautiful vegetables, but this one is showing the fact that our diets, especially in Western countries, is highly processed. Processing isn't a bad thing, but it's the ultra processed foods that we're now worried about. The other way we can see what we eat is sort of an inventory way. What are people buying for themselves? We're assuming in this case, this is a family, an American family, and this is everything they ate in a week. And the interesting thing about this diagram is, this figure, is it does show the preferred foods. And really, yes, there's fruits and vegetables, but there's certainly a lot of convenience foods and things like that. And if you haven't already seen the book Hungry Planet, I really recommend it as a walk through the world in terms of what families all over the world eat. I'm kind of deviating here, but it's really one of my favorite books. So measuring food intake, we said NHANES will give us population data, and I'm going to be showing you some of that. But I also want to make sure that everyone's aware, it's a new term for something we've already been doing for a while. We're calling short food frequencies questionnaires screeners. And it's a quick way to assess intakes, because what we're going to be saying, and one of the take-home messages is that when people think they need a supplement, they don't know if they need the supplement. They've just been told. And screeners are ways that people can find out if their intake of a certain nutrient really is low. Maybe it's sufficient and they don't need to be concerned. So I've put two examples here, a calcium calculator, which is found in the National Osteoporosis Foundation, the American Osteoporosis Group. This is a very simple calcium calculator. Some other osteoporosis groups have a slightly more complicated one. The other advantage is that the person can do it themselves. And it's a teaching tool because it's showing people what good sources of calcium are versus other sources of calcium. Now, I couldn't find one for, let's say, vitamin C, but I found a fairly short list on the government dietary ODS, which is the Office of Dietary Supplements, just good sources of vitamin C. This can turn into a screener, and a person can really just give all the servings they might have in a week, and you just add up all the vitamin C that they consume, divide it by 7, and you've got a daily intake. And again, it's showing really good sources, and yeah, not all vegetables contain a lot of vitamin C. So this is a tool that I hope, if you're not already using that, you will consider it. So let's come back to our question. And the one that is incorrect is iron. And I put iron in there purposely because there always seems to be an article on my phone about iron in older adults. And I grew up in a generation where we would watch TV, our 1 or 2 channels, and there was always a Geritol commercial. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's fine, but it was sold for iron poor blood to older adults. And yet you're going to see some data that shows you that iron actually is not the concern. I also want to point out that in the nutrition facts label, and now we're switching to the new one up here in Canada, it's very similar. Iron remains and vitamin C has been dropped. And so we're going to see that actually vitamin C remains a problem, and iron, at least for older adults, is not too much of a concern. So where do we get the evidence that calcium, magnesium, vitamin C, and vitamin D are these gap nutrients? And here's a paper just from last year by June et al. And if you look down here, you'll see some of these authors are very well known in the field of nutrition. Johanna Dwyer, right here in the middle, Pat Gunther, and Reagan Bailey. Very proficient researchers who use NHANES data. And here they've published intakes of older adults using the 2011-2014 survey from NHANES. And they show that here are the 4 gap nutrients for these adults. They also go on to say that if you divide older adults into normal weight and obese weight, that vitamins A and E actually show up more for those with a higher BMI. And they conclude that there are concerns about meeting nutrient requirements within the calorie needs of older adults. So we can't tell, as I often chastise my students, you can't just tell people to eat more. It's about keeping calories constant and getting more micronutrients, but not more energy. On the CDC website, I actually just Googled dietary supplement use by adults and found this report from February of this year. It's fairly recent data using NHANES 2017 and 18, showing supplement use for adults over age 20 and over. And this first column over here on the left is everybody. And so we have almost 60% of the adult population taking at least one supplement a day. When we divide it into age groups, the younger adults are not taking as many supplements as the older. That is, 57% are not taking the supplement in the youngest adult group and 25% in the lowest adult group. So that means 75% of adults are taking a supplement. In fact, they're not just taking one supplement. Some are taking 2, some are taking 3, and a fairly significant number are taking 4 or more. So if we look at what are people taking, the most common supplement, and I just moved it over here because the color scheme from the last slide is actually the same, but now it represents something different. So just to make this a little bit larger, for those 60 and over, the most common supplement, and I think the numbers might be hidden by our pictures, but they're here as well. MVM, multivitamin and mineral supplements, at 40%, vitamin D alone at 37%, omega-3s 22%, calcium 20%, and vitamin B12 12%. So these are the most common. And then when we look at the prevalence, if we recall from the last slide, some people are taking 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more. And so the numbers that are shown here, if you add them up, don't add up to 100, they add up to a larger number because it represents those who are taking more than one. And of course, they're taking other supplements that aren't included. These are the top 5. So I am going to be presenting information just on what it means to take an MVM or multivitamin and mineral supplement. And we will come back. So we'll be talking about MVMs and also single nutrients and what it means in terms of nutrient status. So in trying to figure out the best way to show whether or not multivitamin mineral supplements in general, but specifically looking at multivitamin minerals, have any value in older adults, I found a recent paper by Taylor Wallace and a very long list of co-authors actually. And what they did is they looked at NHANES data. They went back about 15 years in order to do that. I think it starts in 07, and they needed to use multiple years of NHANES data because they were specifically looking for people who didn't take a multivitamin at all. And then they looked for people who took a multivitamin mineral preparation, but only sporadically. That was between 1 and 15 days. And then they looked at those who took it more than 16 or more days, so for more than half the month. So they really have several things going on here, age as well as age, and they have, is there any value to taking multivitamin but not very often? Now their major findings were that, and it makes sense, it's quite logical, that if you take a multivitamin mineral, you are going to increase your intake. However, if your intake is already sufficient, that won't improve the prevalence of inadequacy. because the prevalence of inadequacy only matters if your intake is less than the EAR. Or I really shouldn't talk about your intake, but the intake of the population. And so looking at the prevalence of inadequacy is actually the most important consideration. The second thing they did, though, that was quite remarkable, is they also tied in nutrient biomarker status. So did it improve above cutoffs for folate, iodine, selenium, B12, B6, B12, and vitamin D. So these particular nutrients of the 18 that they examined went from what might be called deficiency status to improved, possibly normal blood or urine measurements. So they weren't just looking at actual intakes, but they were looking at an improvement in the population nutritional status. And they also found that it was only the regular multivitamin mineral use, not the sporadic, that improved the biomarker. So there seemed to be a need to have a more consistent intake. Now we're going to come back to the finding they have about UL. I'm just going to show you some of their data. The first slide is mean intakes. And we're not going to look at these numbers in any detail because, first of all, we really shouldn't be examining mean intakes. We should always look at prevalence of inadequacy. But I thought it was interesting to see that the average intakes of these 4 GAP nutrients were well below the EAR, indicating, at least in most of the situations, indicating that more than half of the older adults were consuming inadequate amounts. And that there was an improvement, but not always, as people went from no multivitamin mineral to some in a month to more consistent dose. But I'll go to the next slide because this is really what we should focus on. Has the prevalence of inadequacy improved so that the percent is now less when older adults take multivitamins? And the blue bars are the non-users. So they're getting their intake from food alone. I don't know if that's pink or red in the middle are the sporadic users, and the green are the more consistent users. And here are our 2 GAP nutrients, calcium and magnesium. And so almost 60% prevalence of inadequacy of calcium of people. Now, they did several decades, and I didn't want to show all the data because it would just be too many graphs, too many numbers. So I picked a 60 to 71, but really each decade was very similar. So here we have a drop in prevalence of inadequacy when people took a multivitamin containing, which would presumably contain some calcium, and a drop in the prevalence of inadequacy of magnesium with the use of a multivitamin mineral preparation. No change in potassium, which we wouldn't expect because there's really no potassium in these products. But one thing just to note is the fairly high prevalence of inadequacy of zinc that almost disappears with the use of a multivitamin. Now, somewhere in here, really hard to find, is iron. The prevalence of inadequacy, at least from intake, is very low to begin with, and really didn't change. I don't seem to go up a little bit with multivitamin use, but there are some preparations that actually don't even contain iron. So overall, an improvement in the status of intake of calcium and magnesium. If we go to the 2 GAP vitamins, vitamin C and vitamin D, again, we see the same pattern, very high prevalence of inadequacy of vitamin D. I talk a lot about vitamin D and write a lot about vitamin D, and it's not surprising that over 90% are inadequate. However, sun exposure does help, but in the older adult, it's not going to be as much help. I don't want to stray now and talk about one of my favorite topics, but I'll just say that we're just in the process of publishing a commentary in Public Health Nutrition, the journal, talking about vitamin D need in long-term care, where sun exposure is just not going to happen, and a lot of other factors get in the way. Vitamin C, although not as high, is 50% of the population of older adults is inadequate, not meeting their requirement, and taking a multivitamin brings that down to just over 10%. The multivitamin is working for vitamin K as well. Now you see the B vitamins, their prevalence of inadequacy is not that high. Our products, food products in both the United States and Canada, we have enriched grains, we have folic acid fortification. And so just from foods alone, we're not doing too bad. We may have some absorption problems and things like that, but just on an intake basis, the multivitamin does bring that prevalence of inadequacy down close to zero, nevertheless. So we've identified these gap micronutrients. And so now we need to describe strategies to improve their intakes. And I made this table, and I think I was thinking that wouldn't it be nice if we were just all together in a room with everyone at one table and people could just brainstorm about strategies and then think about examples. And yeah, it would be a nice afternoon, but we really don't have the time to do that. So I went ahead and just put down 3 common strategies. Promoting nutrient-dense foods, that would be using some sort of behavior change communication. So it's really a lot about knowledge. We also fortify foods, and that can be a government policy. And then finally, we can talk about supplements and think about the major supplements that people take, which are tablets or pills or drops. And if we look at effectiveness, all of these strategies are effective, and they don't have to be done alone, of course. The problem with promoting nutrient-dense foods is it does work, but it takes a long time. And we are now referring to that time as nudging, because we just can't come along and make people change overnight. So there is a nudging towards a change in how people eat. Fortification of foods is very effective when it's mandatory. It's less effective when it isn't. And that's has been our solution, but I think that the door may have closed on mandatory fortification, as people now don't want the government to be putting chemicals in their food. At least that's how it's viewed in countries that don't have mandatory fortification. And then supplements are effective for the users who take the supplements that they need. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. I just wanted to quickly mention that some of these strategies are culturally appropriate if you promote the right foods or you fortify the right vehicle. But for supplements, there really isn't any culture that says, let's take a pill every morning. So it is a barrier to using supplements. So it's not an easy, simple answer. And then finally, and we will come back to this with supplements, is it safe? Now, I'm not going to go into unsafe food practices, but generally we're eating foods. We have good networks of value chains for getting food, and it's nutrient dense. So I haven't seen too much about problems there. And in terms of fortification, it's safe because the amount is carefully chosen. But when you fortify foods for one group, another group also gets that fortified food. So when you fortify for neural tube defect prevention, a lot of non-pregnant women are also eating those foods. And supplements, we're going to talk a little bit more about safety, but we're really talking mostly about moderate multivitamin mineral products that have high quality. But if someone uses supplements indiscriminately or orders them from wherever, there can be safety concerns. Now, I went ahead and sort of thought about how we could look at nutrient-dense foods that aren't fortified, and then look at fortified choices and think about different supplements. But I'm going to skip this slide because I think it's fairly self-evident. But what it also reminded me is there's classes of foods that don't really fit into these three groups. I was just call them here meal replacement foods, but it's like you're eating a food and there's a multivitamin in that food. So products such as Ensure, Total Cereal, and the new one that seems to be hot with the computer crowd is Soylent. Now, one problem with some of these foods is that people aren't happy with them if it's all they get to eat and there's no choice. But also, when you put a multivitamin into food, then people taste every one of those minerals and vitamins. So it does have a problem. Now, just coming back to safety, this was a cover story. It's been a while now, almost 13 years, but it's Canada's answer to Time Magazine or Newsweek, and it had this glaring cover story: vitamins can be hazardous to your health. And of course, it annoyed me greatly, being someone familiar with the DRI process. It was like, what, we have ULs. What are they talking about? Of course, we know that vitamins can be hazardous to your health. And it just seemed to me, and it just reminded me that the rest of the world hasn't caught up all the time with our DRI process. They are not familiar with the fact that ULs have been chosen to be values that the consumer shouldn't go over unless they're under care of a health professional, and that the safety of those particular vitamins, well, they call them vitamins, but they mean all nutrients, has been assessed. So are supplements unsafe? Well, yes and no, and maybe it depends. So yes, they can be hazardous to your health if you're consuming well over the UL, or you're consuming doses that are so high in an acute amount. But no, if you're below the UL. And then depends, well, yeah, and there's other things. So it's not simple, but it almost seemed like this story was saying, no one's thought about this before. But I do warn you that the public hasn't thought of this before. So I get mad at the health professionals and reporters who should know better, because I think I did write to the reporter. But the public still doesn't understand a U shape, and we have to patiently explain it to them. My favorite way of explaining it is, don't overwater your plants, but don't underwater them. And it sounds, you can't, it's not a childish message. It's just, what does U-shape mean? So coming back to, are they unsafe? Well, the Wallace study looked at which segment of the population that was not taking, and consistently taking a multivitamin had intakes over the UL. And I just chose one of the age groups. Oh no, actually, sorry, all the age groups in this one are here. But the only nutrients that they found that had any appreciable over the UL percentage were, I just highlighted, sorry, one of the decades, the 60 to 70-year-old, and 10% of the population was over the UL for folic acid, 4% was over the UL for calcium, 2% for zinc, and 0.4 for selenium. And that when people didn't take a multivitamin, there was really very little over the UL. So yes, it is a risk. And that's where those screeners come in. If a person doesn't need calcium or is already getting enough calcium in their diet, then they really don't need to take a product that will give them so much more. In the case of folic, though, it is a slight problem with the supplement industry itself, in that they are over enthusiastic about having more of nutrients that are needed, especially considering we have mandatory folic acid fortification. But I have seen folic acid levels drop in products recently over the last few years. So percent over the UL is indicative of people using a product when they don't need it. So finally, I want to just discuss a few areas of supplement use that maybe are a little less well known. I want to help you come to your own decision about answering the question that we raised in this in this title, which is Are Vitamin Mineral Supplement Necessary for Healthy Aging? I want to first introduce you to a concept, which is the inverse supplement hypothesis. And I didn't give the reference for this, I really should have, but I wrote a paper with my colleagues and we published it in the Canadian Journal of Dietetic Practice and Research, and the references here, where we examined barriers to healthful eating, and we looked at barriers to supplement use in low-income adults. And that was because the research has shown that people who don't need supplements take them. And we sometimes refer to these as the worried well, and talk about vitamins and minerals being insurance against not getting enough. But it was proposed that the inverse of this, people who don't need supplements are the ones who take them, ask the question, well, what about the people who have poor diets and don't take supplements? And those are the supplements that they might need. So we did a qualitative study in our city, and we had a series of questions, and we went to focus groups that were comprised of people who lived in neighborhoods that had known health inequalities, and many of the people lived in poverty. And I was really fortunate to have a wonderful facilitator who managed to find many focus groups for this study. We also interviewed key informants who are health professionals, pharmacists, dietitians, who worked with these people and knew their struggles with balancing budgets and getting healthy food. And we have all these themes that our respondents told us. Now, just due to time, I chose two themes. One is knowledge, and the other one down here is cost. In terms of knowledge, we were actually quite surprised at some of the things our respondents told us, especially the focus groups. In general, they said there were too many choices and they didn't know if they even needed it. So here's a few quotes that I go down the aisle and they just don't know what they would take. They're also skeptical. I don't know how they will help me. And they also had legitimate questions. Are the vitamins and minerals in supplements the same as vitamin minerals in vegetables and fruit? Because they get the message about vegetables and fruit. They just might not have the money or the ability to buy them like they want to. In terms of cost, the people in the focus groups did talk about the cost of supplements, and so we'll come to that. But we did a parallel study looking at our survey data in Canada and found almost consistently with age groups, this is 70 and older, 50 to 70, 30 to 50, and 19 to 30, that almost every group of men and women, those who took supplements were those with the higher income. So the highest income group in this gray color was 65% for women, and that probably included a lot of calcium supplements. And the lowest were in the use of supplements was in the lowest income group. So there was this gradient. And we also know that there is a gradient in eating healthy food between low and high income. So I just have a question for you, and we might not be able to see this if we're in the way, but do you think that supplements are expensive? For any reason at all. You might think they're expensive because they're unnecessary, or they're just expensive because they cost a lot when you see them in a pharmacy or a grocery store. I'll just give you a minute to vote on that. So I'm not promoting this product, but I went online to try to find something. And Centrum is a leading multivitamin mineral. They pride themselves in being the first to maybe add new nutrients if they feel that that's valid, and to change numbers and things like that. But it doesn't mean other multivitamin mineral preparations aren't as good, because they just copy the science, and then they make one a little bit cheaper. So that's what I guess marketing is all about. But here we have a product for older adults, and that's important because you do want to choose for your own age group and, if possible, age and sex. 3 months supply of 100 tablets. And is are supplements expensive? Well, first answer would be no, because this product is 20 cents a day. So for 20 cents, you're getting the equivalent amount of vitamin D as you would in a very expensive salmon steak, or you're getting the amount of calcium you might get in a glass of milk, and so forth. So 20 cents a day to reach those gap nutrients or other nutrients like zinc is actually pretty inexpensive. But I just want to put a caveat on that. This $20 that's here is $20 from someone who is low income. That's $20 out of their food budget. And so that's something that many of our respondents told us that they weren't able to do at one time. And so they're not able to take advantage of the cheapness, actually, of supplements. But of course, the other side of the coin is yes, those of you who would say yes, is that if people are buying things indiscriminately, and we did a study, I didn't show the data here, where essentially people were coming into our medication assessment center at the university with a shoebox full of products that they were using and replenishing every month. And that wasn't $20, that was hundreds of dollars. So there is a continuum from this is really cost effective, and that's the sort of home economist in us saying that, to this is very expensive and we have to be concerned. So this leads me to my final point, which is I find though, and our respondents told us, that health professionals are very inconsistent in their messaging, and these people were confused, and they didn't feel that they were getting any support to take a supplement, even though we tell people with osteoporosis all the time, well, of course you need calcium and vitamin D, it's just a done deal. They felt that they weren't getting consistent message. And here's an example. Here's a title of an editorial in 2013, and I'm sure that this is repeated over and over again in classes, medical school, even maybe nursing, and I know in dietetics, it's a common sentiment. Enough is enough. Stop wasting money on vitamin and mineral supplements. And it's very interesting when you start reading it, it's very, very absolute. The case is closed, supplementing the diet of, now here's the kicker, well-nourished adults and then in brackets, it says most vitamin and mineral supplements is no benefit and might be harmful. So the caveat of, well, we only mean well-nourished, we don't mean people who need it, is lost in the title. And the most means, well, everybody knows you need folate when you're pregnant, and you need vitamin D many times in your life. Those caveats get lost in the message. And so we have a inconsistent message on whether or not supplements should be, I don't want to say promoted, it's either recommended, or if the client chooses to take them, they need feedback on what they're taking and a lot more information. So I want to leave some time for questions, but I've just put a brief message for the three learning objectives, just that we did see that there are gap micronutrients based on very valid data from Ann Haynes. And I wanted to add that screeners can help identify at the individual level, because using population data can sometimes not be that useful. That using supplements, in particular a multivitamin mineral, if you really don't know too much about whether that person is inadequate in more than one, but a screener is a nice way to help identify that. And so instead of taking a multivitamin mineral, perhaps just a single nutrient such as vitamin D might be all that's needed. That they are cost effective, they're safe, but we want to stay below the UL. Just reminding us though that they're not culturally appropriate. And we had the opportunity to go into the northern part of our province where we have many Indigenous people, and we happened upon a display of traditional medicines, and the young woman describing them in almost every case talked about how this product would be made into a tea. So there are some ways that people can take supplemental nutrients in a more culturally appropriate way. But for many people, taking 1 or 2 supplements a day doesn't seem to be a huge problem, except they may forget, as we saw with all the sporadic users. And then finally, there are contradictory messages about supplements, and we shouldn't confuse, or we shouldn't dismiss the benefits that might be achieved at the individual level with some of these population studies, randomized controlled trials that don't show a change in mortality, for example. Things like that shouldn't be confused into the messaging at the individual level. So I'll just switch to the last slide and hope that we do have time for questions.
We do, and there was a few in the chat, a lot of great dialogue and conversations in the chat box. One of the first questions, actually, was talking about, when you were talking about inadequacy rate for iron, is that also low for vegans?
Well, that's the kind of data that that group would go and find. I would suspect that one would have to use many years of NHANES data to find a large enough group of older adults who are vegan. That was everybody, vegan or not. Now, remember that the RDA, no, just a minute, I got to back away from that. The EAR for iron for older adults is around 6 milligrams. So it is much different than the EAR for women of childbearing age, for example. So we're already starting with a lower iron requirement, but that would be an interesting research question. And, you know, people in the room might think that. It's what can be achieved using the NHANES data, but I don't have an answer.
Thank you for that. And then the next question is a conversation about medical doctors prescribing 4,000 IUs of vitamin D3.
Mm-hmm.
And the participant said they're concerned about that due to the fact that vitamin D is a fat soluble.
Well, the reason they use 4,000 is that is the UL. And it's a little ironic because you can't buy a 4,000 IU preparation, I don't think. You can buy 2,000 and you can buy 5,000, although I'll tell you in my country I can't. I can only buy 1,000 at a time. The medical profession is both enthusiastic and uninterested in vitamin D. So the article that we are just publishing now in Public Health Nutrition talks about that 2,000 is worked really well in a study, and that's what we were commenting on. So I personally don't think 4,000 is a concern, but it may not be necessary. Yeah, so I'm just saying it's not a huge amount. 10,000 I'd start to really get concerned about, or actually even 5. But yeah, I'd be happy to share what our thoughts are on this, and certainly we'll send that information to Dr. Dahl.
Great.
It's just, yeah.
Thank you. And one other question that I saw was, can you talk about how a multivitamin would function in the body? Can you process all the nutrients at once, or does your body prioritize what's most needed?
Well, that's a really good question. What I've seen is generally people are recommended to take a multivitamin with food. So if someone took it in the morning and they also ate breakfast, that certainly would be sufficient. And that would help with fat-soluble vitamins. There's a little bit of competition between nutrients that are within a multivitamin, but so are there competitions between nutrients that are in food, for example. So I really don't know how all these things are partitioned. It's slightly mysterious, but the absorption of various nutrients take place in totally different ways, and very few are truly competitive. Iron and zinc, for example, do compete. But I don't know if things are necessarily prioritized at the absorption level. I guess I don't, maybe I came into nutrition during that chemical era in the 80s and 90s, or certainly in the 80s, where it was all about the chemistry. And the food form and the microbiome were totally, first of all, we didn't know about a microbiome really. And the food form there was a passing interest, but it was more about, the milligrams. And I think there is a lot more that's going on, but you have to look around and say, well, so far we're surviving well on what we're doing in terms of, eating all these nutrients together at once. So it's a difficult thing to answer. And I think there are people who are looking at food versus supplements and seeing that sometimes food does promote absorption better. But I'll just remind you that the dietary folate equivalents are based on the fact that folic acid, which is just the chemical form of folate, is absorbed so much better than food form. So there's no single answer for all nutrients. So yeah, good question, but difficult to think about.
So on that same note about multivitamins, is it better to take a multivitamin or several different?
Well, that again is difficult because a multivitamin, I've used this analogy and I don't know if it's necessarily a good one. I call it a mutual fund approach to investment. You're not really sure where to put your money, so you put it in a whole lot of different places. And it's not going to harm you, and it's not really that expensive, as you can see. But if you start taking a lot of individual nutrients, what you're doing is multiplying the cost. So if you take a multivitamin, you have sometimes 50 different micronutrients. And some of them might not be the ones you need, like vanadium, but they're in there. And if you started to choose single supplements, you're now paying essentially the same price for each one of those 50 micronutrients. So that's really what the debate is about. And it's going to really depend on the person. I don't necessarily have to reveal myself, but I happen to know that I'm low on certain nutrients and I tend to lean towards taking them. In the case of B12, for example, and a B12 pernicious anemia runs in my Finnish side of my family, the 10 micrograms that you would get in a multivitamin really aren't enough. If you have pernicious anemia, you actually need a very high dose. So, that's why I think, and I'll just come to my conclusion, is that dietitians should take hold of what's in supplements, what people need, and include that in their assessment of their clients. because once they get hold of the fact that they have the knowledge of deciding whether certain products are better than others, then they can do so much more. And so I know some dietitians have been reluctant to do this, but others have embraced it. So it doesn't take too much to immerse yourself in what are the different situations why you might need something and which product might be better. But of course, you're also looking at the preferences of the person or the people that you're dealing with.
Dr. Whiting, thank you so very much today for your expertise and tons of positive feedback in the chat box for an excellent presentation. So thank you so much. I know we did not get to all of the questions today, so we will make sure we follow up with you all when we send out the survey links or the recording link rather. So thank you again, Dr. Whiting. So appreciate you being here with us today.
Oh, I enjoyed thinking about this topic. So it was really good for me as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session.